So here's my Diablo IV character at the moment, level 52 Sorcerer, and in terms of the build that I've been playing, it is primarily focused around Ice Shards as my main damaging move, along with all of the defensive skills, just to make sure I can keep the barrier active at all times, and the Deep Freeze ultimate. If you want to look directly into the way that the abilities are set up on the skill tree, we have Frostbolt and Enhanced Frostbolt. These 2 points are just in here because I needed to reach the core skills where I've maxed out Ice Shards. So there's 5 points into this, and it's quite strong. I found it to be really handy when it comes to high density areas or like crowded spaces with lots of mobs. They also ricochet if the enemy's frozen, and also when I have a barrier active, which I'm getting that barrier every time I use a defensive cooldown from another passive within this tree, which we'll go over. We've also slotted in Fireball just for the enchantment effect, so it's not on the skill bar. It's just so that when an enemy dies, there's a bit more AoE damage that comes through. In terms of the defensive skills, I've gone ahead and just picked all of them up. 1 point into each of these, so Flame Shield, Teleport, Ice Armor, and then I've maxed out Frost Nova. So starting off with Frost Nova, what it's going to do is make sure all the enemies are frozen every 17 seconds for up to 3 seconds. When the enemies are frozen, it just means that I can ricochet and do more damage towards frozen enemies. I'm also making sure that we're getting the cooldown back with the enhancement, and that the enemies are vulnerable, so they take 20% more damage from me once I have used my Frost Nova. Ice Armor is quite good because it is that barrier effect, which again helps us when it comes to the ricochet on Ice Shards. It's also giving us a lot of mana regeneration, so 25%, as well as anytime we hit a vulnerable enemy, we get more Ice Armor barrier, which synergizes quite well with the mystical Frost Nova. Teleport's quite good. It's just a really handy way of getting out of sticky situations. You can also make sure the cooldown gets decreased. If you hit, I think, up to 6 enemies, you get 3 seconds off. And then also that 30% damage reduction, just in case you end up teleporting into even more danger. Flame Shield's quite good. It gives you that immunity for 2.2 seconds, as well as that movement speed for 25%, and healing you for 50% of your missing life. So you could always use this in between potion cooldowns just to make sure that you're staying nice and healthy and that you're not getting overwhelmed by the enemies because of that immunity. We also have maxed out glass cannons for the 18% increased damage, and 1 point into elemental attunement. This is just making sure that we have that lucky hit chance of maybe reducing the cooldown of a defensive skill. I don't actually see it proc too much, but it's just nice to have that 1 point. It only happens once every 10 seconds, but when it does happen, it just means that you can get one of these skills back. In terms of the conjuration skills, not really spec'd into any of these. I've just picked up a few passives, starting off with the Align the Elements, which basically gives you that damage reduction against elites up to 40%, and then maxing out protection. So every time I use a cooldown, which technically is all of these defensive skills, I will then get a barrier for 2 seconds. And then whenever I use 100 mana, I get 15% damage reduction. You're going to be using a lot of mana when it comes to Ice Shards. You can just spam that skill pretty much all the time. I've also got 15% into Lucky Hit. So again, we're trying to get that barrier active as much as possible, so every time we use a cooldown we'll get that. Whenever we have a barrier active, it also means that our Ice Shards are going to be ricocheting off all enemies. Moving into the Mastery skills. Quite light here, I haven't picked up any of these abilities. Just put 1 point into all of these passives. I'm just testing them out at the moment. I don't know which one's working for me more than any of the others, but at the moment there is one that when you have a barrier active, which is pretty much 90% of the time, you apply more chill, which in essence helps you freeze enemies quicker. We also have Snap Freeze, which is lucky hit dependent, but it just means frost skills can instantly freeze, which is quite good. I don't know how much it's proccing though. And then we have Icy Veil, which increases the duration of barriers, but again, these barriers are quite short in duration to begin with, so I don't actually know how much 5% is doing for this. When it comes to the ultimate, I've gone with Deep Freeze, another defensive skill. It also counts as a cooldown, and it freezes enemies nearby, which is quite strong. It also gives you a barrier, which is again what we need, is just barrier uptime. And ideally as well, what you want to do is use this after all of your non-ultimates are on cooldown, because what it does is it reduces all of their cooldowns by 50%, which is quite good as well. With these passives here, I've maxed out Permafrost, so I'm stronger against elites, and then I've also got 1 point, again just testing these out to make sure I can see which one feels better for me, either increasing cold damage against vulnerable enemies, which again you're getting from Frost Nova's enhancement. And then the other two here is Frigid Breeze, which makes sure that when you damage vulnerable enemies, you can have a chance of getting some mana back. It is quite low, so I'm not sure how useful this is going to be in the long run, but I've just slotted in for now. And then I also have Hoarfrost, which increases damage against chilled and frozen enemies, which in this case should be everyone because your main skill is Ice Shards. We've also got Avalanche, it's a lucky hit proc. Again, we've put up 15% lucky hit. Frost skills have a 10% chance to make your next cast of Ice Shards cost no mana and also deal 40% increased damage. It's also doubled against vulnerable enemies, so again, once you've used that Frost Nova, made the enemies vulnerable, if you can get the Avalanche proc, it means that your next Ice Shards, which is the only skill we're using, can cost no mana and do an extra up to 80% damage, which is quite strong. In terms of my legendaries that I have at the moment, I know a lot of these I can probably swap around. So we have the helmet, which is giving me 25% less damage from crowd controlled enemies. This is something I can probably change. Barrier generation is quite good here since we have a lot of barriers in our kit. The chest piece, what I ended up rolling on this one was the frost skill damage and ultimate skill damage and cold damage, which again is all related to Ice Shards. Also damaging an elite gives me another barrier, which again is like my 6th way of getting a barrier, so really powerful here. In terms of my gloves, I've got 2 ranks to Ice Shards, which is quite good, and then dealing 17% increased damage when a barrier is active, which again will be 90% of the time. When it comes to the pants, this is probably something I can change. There's nothing really great about these ones specifically. I know it's got Firewall on here, damage reduction against close enemies. Having a barrier active means that I can ignore distant enemies, which is quite good, but again I haven't really seen this proc too much, but we can just do a bit more testing to see how this works. With the boots, we have the Flame Shield imprint. So this means that whenever Flame Shield is active, I can move through enemies, which can be quite helpful for when you're in a dungeon with loads of different enemies. And also the Flame Shield, moving through enemies while it's active, can immobilize them for around 2.3 seconds, which is quite strong. It also gives +1 to Flame Shield and +2 to Frost Nova and +1 to Ice Armor, which are all defensive skills which we're using. My staff here probably can use an upgrade. I've imprinted it with the 10% increased damage every time I stand still, up to 30%, a bit of life on kill, damage to chilled enemies, nothing too special about this one here. When it comes to the rings, the first one that I'm looking at is barrier generation. I know fire damage is also on here. I think it's working with my fireball enchant, so that's still good to have. And then the main thing here is using a cooldown restores 15 mana. So right now we don't have a basic skill. We do need to make sure that our mana is coming back. Otherwise, if we're out of mana, we don't really have anything to do because Ice Shards is the only damaging skill we have available. With the next ring, I deal 30% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. So again, freezing enemies is going to be top priority. We also have +6% cold damage and a bit of fire damage here as well. Damage to slowed enemies, which I believe when an enemy's chilled, they might count as slowed. I'm not 100% sure, but it's still good to have. Then for my necklace, I have +1 to all defensive skills, which is amazing because again, 4 out of 6 of our skills on our action bar are defensive skills. We also have 9.6% frost skill damage, which again is Ice Shards. And then the imprint here is Ice Shards can pierce 5 times, dealing 17% less damage per hit. With the piercing and the ricochet, it just means you have a lot of Ice Shards flying around the field. In terms of my enchantments, we've got Fireball, as I mentioned before, so just killing an enemy explodes 50% of the fireball's damage. And then I've also put in Ice Shards at the moment. It just means that whenever there's a frozen enemy near me, it doesn't have to be myself freezing the enemy, it could be any of my party members, but if they are frozen, Ice Shards will automatically come out and hit them. And I'm doing more damage to frozen enemies, and I'm ricocheting on frozen enemies, and my ice shards are piercing. So all of that together is just insane. Whenever I cast Frost Nova, it pretty much just destroys everything on the field. So I can just jump into a battle now and just have a look and see how this is working for me. So we'll just go and look for any enemies. Maybe we'll just do this event while it's here. So you can see here if I use Frost Nova, I mean that one just died, so I'll wait for the next group to come through. Ideally we want to have the barriers active, and then you'll see the ice shards just piercing and ricocheting off the enemies. Every time the enemy dies, you'll also notice that the fireball comes out. So if they're grouped up, it's even better. But right now what I'll do is my Frost Nova, and you'll see automatically just the ice shards coming out without me having to do anything. Also I've got my ult, so that's on R1 at the moment. Using that, it just ends up chilling and freezing all the enemies. If I come out of it, they're all just dead. It also helps with the cooldown of my other skill, so it just means I can use all of them all over again. Always making sure you have a barrier active. Teleport also grants a barrier because it's a cooldown skill, and then when you've got them all grouped up, Frost Nova will freeze everything, meaning that the ice shards will come out automatically and hit every enemy nearby. So we'll see how this works against these elites now. Well, that worked pretty well. So what happened there is I froze all the enemies, meaning I do more damage towards them. Whenever they're frozen, the ice shards automatically come out and hit each of them. It'll ricochet, it'll pierce, and every time an enemy dies, a fireball is going to explode, which hits everyone around them, and it can cause a chain reaction. So that's what happened there, and I ended up just pretty much destroying them all straight away. But yeah, there we have it. That's my build at the moment. There are a few adjustments that I'm looking to make. In terms of where I got those aspects from, we can look into the Codex of Power. The two main ones that are quite important is Prodigy, which using a cooldown restores 15 mana, and that can be obtained by completing Witch Water in the Hawazar region. We also have Aspect of Piercing Cold, which is the one where ice shards pierce enemies, and that one you can get by completing Dead Man's Dredge in the Fractured Peaks. So yeah, I will keep you guys updated and see if there's any changes to this build at all, but so far it's feeling really strong. Obviously we're still in World Tier 2, but when we get up to 3 and 4, I'll see if this can keep up, but from what I'm seeing in terms of barriers and immunities, it has helped a lot when it comes to those more chaotic fights and boss battles. Until then, see you guys soon.